Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to make a crinkle textured knife from a standard 1095 high carbon steel knife blank. Now this particular video is going to be a little bit longer than my standard videos, and that's because I want to show the entire process from the start of starting out with the blank to the finished knife, including sharpening. Now, as many of you know, Jason Northgard and I just recently finished a book called Introduction to Knife Making, the Beginner's Do-It-Yourself Guide to Making Knives. In that book, which is very, very heavily illustrated with full-color photographs and diagrams, has a bunch of information in there for the beginner and novice knife maker. But it also has a section on making a knife from a knife blank. And that's really what I wanted to look at and cover on today's video. It's a really good place for the beginner or novice knife maker to start. Starting with a knife blank, and the knife blanks that I have available on DIYEasyCrafts.com are all high quality 1095 high carbon steel. They're 3/16 thick. They come with holes pre-drilled to hold the handles or scales on. They do have to be reamed out with a 1/4-inch drill bit, but other than that, they're ready to go. Now for the crinkled texture, we're going to actually etch that texture onto the blade. I use an electro etching process. So I have a piece of angle iron. I have the electrical lead from a 12-volt car battery charger hooked up to the blade, the negative lead to the back of that angle iron. I have the battery charger set at 12 volts, 2 amps, and I wrap the angle iron in gauze so that the metal never touches metal. The knife blank is actually only being touched by the dampened gauze, and the gauze is dampened in an electrolyte solution, which is just warm water and salt. The crinkle texture actually comes right from the texture of the gauze, of the woven gauze. And I etched every area of the blank that was going to be exposed after the handles were attached for about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, probably 30 or 40 seconds at a time, and then I'd move it a little bit and etch another area. They're a very easy texture or very easy blade finish to get. You can always just check out to see if the texture is deep enough, and just by sanding it off with a very fine emery, and you can start to see that texture forming. I like to etch my blade texture on high carbon steel prior to heat treating, and that's kind of against the grain. Most people do all of their etching after heat treating, but I find that the end result, you have a little bit of a darker background and contrast. Regardless, once the etching is done, it's time to bevel, to grind a bevel on that blank. And for a lot of beginner knife makers, getting a good bevel is the hardest part of the whole process. Knife making basically consists of a bunch of different processes. Each step may not be very difficult, but you have to kind of master each one individually. I use a 2x72 grinder. It's an Oregon blade maker. It has a 2-horsepower motor, variable speed. In conjunction with that, I use a tilt table. That's a table that allows me to set it at the angle of the bevel, and I just use it as a rest. I can lay the blade right on that table, press it so that it's laying flat, bring the blade right up into the belt, and then pull it across. It's not really a jig, more of a tool rest. It's a product that Jason Northgard and I both make and sell, but it's really just a very easy way of creating very nice bevels, either flat grinding or hollow grinding with a large wheel attachment. But however you want to do the bevels, if you want to do it on a 1-inch grinder, belt grinder, if you wanted to do it with an angle grinder, the most acceptable way is with a 2x72, just because it makes life easy. But if you don't have that piece of equipment, You can even do bevels with a file if you wanted to. Now, once the rough bevels are done, and that means that the majority of the material has been removed, but I'm still leaving a little bit of thickness there to clean up after heat treating. I'm going to move this blade over and I'm going to heat treat it. I heat treat it in a propane-powered forge. This one's a 2-burner forge from Devil Forge. A very, very nice compact unit. Doesn't use a lot of fuel. It's very efficient. And it really heats up the knife quickly and evenly. Now, the whole trick to heat treating 1095 is to bring it up to non-magnetic. I've got a little magnet attached to the outside of the forge, right up by the top of the door. So I can very easily take the blade out, touch it against that magnet, see when the blade has reached the non-magnetic state, and then I just take a visual note of that color. And you want to hold the blade at that color without creating any, hotter areas, for a couple of minutes. If you can hold it for 2 or 3 minutes, that would be perfect. And then you quench it very quickly into oil. And you can use, people use used motor oil. You can use canola oil, vegetable oil, or you could go out and buy, an oil that's specially made for heat treating. So once the blade is up to temperature, and again, I move it back and forth. I keep the bevel end down away from the direct flame, and then quench it right in the oil. Sometimes if you keep the bevel up, the narrower bevel tip will have a tendency of overheating. So I keep the spine of the knife in the flame when it's in the forge. After heat treating, and there's also another process called tempering in an oven 375 for 2 hours, 2 cycles at that. I can then go back and sand off with about a 300 grit paper and really expose what that crinkle effect is going to look like. The tempering takes a knife that is hard and makes it less brittle. So it is an important step. You don't want to skip out on that one. Then it's going to be back to the grinder and back to the tilt table. I never changed the angle that this tilt table was set at, so it's very easy to go right back and clean up the bevels. So I'm really just removing the dark areas on the bevels, the slag, oxidation from the heat treating process. I usually do this with a finer grit belt. The rough ground bevels can be done with a 60 grit. When I clean them up, it's usually with an 80 or a 120. For this particular knife, this is a commissioned knife. It's gonna add a little bit of an effect to have the shiny bevels against that dark, crinkled blade texture. The contrast will work in our favor. And also, when you're finishing up the bevels, you want to make sure that the plunge line on both sides of the blade matches up. And you want to bring the thickness of the actual beveled blade down to a point where you can finish sharpening it with a micro bevel. So this is the blank. It's got the textured crinkle effect on the blade. It's got the bevels done. It's been heat treated. It's been tempered, and the bevels have been polished. So now we're going to move on to scales. Everybody does this a little bit differently. The way that I do it probably takes a little bit longer, but it does give me a little bit of control over putting both scales on exactly where I want them. I epoxy one side on at a time, and I position that side exactly where I want it. I've already shaped the forward edge of these scales, and I've already polished that forward edge. I clean off whatever extra epoxy. It's a 2-part epoxy, 2-ton, 2-part epoxy. I clean it off with a little paper towel and some rubbing alcohol. Once that dries, I'll move it over to a drill press. Note that I've got a big clamp acting as a stop, and I've got a backer board to prevent blowout from the other side of the scales. And I'll just use the guide holes through the blank to drill the pinholes through the scale material or the handle material. So if that blade were to catch in the drill bit and start to spin, it would spin clockwise, and it wouldn't be able to go anywhere because of that big C-clamp that I've got attached to the drill base or the drill table. At this time, I'm going to also cut away a lot of the excess material from that first side of the handles. And this will just make it easier later on. I can also cut away the second side in a similar fashion before I go back to the belt grinder. Now I use a little scroll saw, but you could certainly use a bandsaw. And this is the first glimpse of what the finished product is going to look like. So we've got one side of the handles on, and we've got the holes drilled for the pins on one side. Now I'm going to attach the other side. Same process. I put 2-part epoxy on both the scales as well as on the blank. Both have been roughed up with sandpaper. Both have been degreased with alcohol and dried. So there's no grease on either the handle or on the tang of the scales, of the blank. And then I'm going to position that exactly where I want it. Clamp it, let that dry. Once that dries, I'm going to go back over to the scroll saw, cut away the excess material. And now both sides of the handles will be attached to the blank. I still have to drill, through for the pinholes on that second side. And I'm going to use the holes that are on the first side and through the blank as the guide. So I'm back to the drill press. I'm holding this flat against the backer board. And this final hole goes right through all 3 pieces. So it goes through both sides of the scales as well as the blank. And that really saves a lot of hassle later on. You don't have uneven holes. Inserting the pins through this is very easy. I use a slightly oversized drill bit. And now I'm going to shape the scales or the handles. It's actually called profiling the scales. I use a coarse grit belt right on the belt sander. I like to use the belt sander for the majority of the work on these knives. I can do the inside edges just by letting that belt expand past the right-hand edge so that it has kind of a soft edge for doing those curves. And this could be a 60 or an 80 grit belt. It very quickly takes off the material. You'll hear when it's actually hitting the steel. And this is going to leave rough grind lines that are horizontal on that tang of the blade. I'm going to go back vertical, getting rid of the tool rest, the 90-degree tool rest, and using a finer grit belt in order to get rid of all those grind lines. The knife is really starting to take shape now. So now I'm set up on a flat platen. Same setup that I use to profile vertically to get rid of the horizontal grind lines from profiling against that work or with the work table in place. And at the same time, if I want to reduce the thickness of the scales, I can do that. Remember the airborne contaminants from these grinders and the different materials. It's always recommended to use a respirator when using the grinder. I will also at the same time start to round over that top edge of the handles just to make it a little bit more comfortable in your hands. That inside edge I can do either with a small wheel, with a Dremel grinder, or even just with a oscillating sander. Now I will also polish the handles right on the belt sander. First I'm going to use a small wheel attachment to get rid of the horizontal lines from profiling the handles. Whenever you're using the small wheel attachment, I like to slow down the RPMs a little bit so you don't wear out those bearings. And you're going to go through the belts. And then you're going to go through an 80, a 120, a 240, and take it to whatever desired grit you want for the finish that you want. Usually an 800 works nicely. Get a nice smooth finish that can be buffed out. Almost there. When I say I like the sand, with that flat platen, I also like to buff with the flat platen. So the handles, I've gone through the belts. I've gone, 240, 400, 800, 12, and 2000, and then I'm using a felt buffing belt with compound to actually polish up the scales. I do that at a slower RPM. The next step, and the final step, is sharpening. Now, you can go out and buy, separate sharpening systems. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can sharpen your knives, but I create the micro bevel right on the flat platen of the Oregon Blade Maker 2x72 grinder. Depending on how much material there is to remove, I start with either a 120 or a 240 grit belt. And I establish, what I try to do is establish that micro bevel and then change the belt to a finer grit. First I'll do one side, let's say we're doing the 120, then I'll flip and do the other side at 120, trying to create a burr along the entire edge. Once the burr is created, then I'll change the belt and go to a finer grit belt, like a 240. And then very quickly, I'll flip the burr on both sides with the 240, and then I'll go to a 400 and do the exact same thing. So you want to create a burr and make sure that that burr is along the entire edge of the knife. And then once that's created, flip sides, create a burr on the other side, and then once it's been created on both sides, you can go to the next grit belt, next finer grit belt. Usually I'll take these right down to 2000. So you're creating the burr, and then you're basically polishing the micro bevel and flipping the burr as you go through the different belts. So it's a lot of belt changes, but it goes very quickly. For all of the sharpening, you want to keep the RPMs down on the belt grinder, usually about 30% or so. And you don't really want to apply a lot of pressure. Trying to hold it at that same angle. Just follow that micro bevel. Flip sides. Follow the micro bevel on the other side. And then take a good look at it. Sometimes I use a magnifying glass that's attached to the light on my belt grinder. And most times I can just feel it with my finger. I can feel that burr. The final step is to use a leather stroke, a leather belt. A lot of people will use this in motion. I don't. I just use it against the flat platen, static. I hold it at just a slightly sharper angle than I did the grinding. Once I'm done with the leather stroping, the knife is sharp, usually razor sharp. Now, I've run out of hair on the one arm, so I had to switch over to my other arm, but you can see very easily shaves the hair on my arm. So this is it, the final product, a 1095 high carbon steel knife made from a blank, available from DIYeasycrafts.com. The handles are a Juma dragon scale handles from Jant's Supply. It's got brass pins. I actually put black liners on this particular knife. And of course, it's got the crinkle texture created with electro etching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you tolerated it being a little longer than the other videos. Please join us on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. If you want to see other knives that I've made, check out my site at Knifemaking.com. By all means, please join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. Thank you very much.